Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, we have quite a bit of news to cover today, and for once, over the course of these past few weeks, it will not be an entirely Ukraine centric episode. We still have plenty to cover, especially with Mariupol, with some of the events that have happened in Ukraine since, but we have a lot of news about NATO. We even have some Middle Eastern news to bring back right now, and we just have a lot of ground to cover, including, of course, the current energy troubles. But let's get right into it, starting with the crisis in Ukraine, as it were, with the conflict in Ukraine, as it were. And without further ado, I will let you take the floor from here.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, I guess Mariupol, that's where the really big news is. But before we do that, I want to clear up something that that we did on the show last week, and that was about the Severodonetsk river crossing near, I believe, it's Belogoroyevka town. This is in the larger Izium area, which is adjacent to where much of the battle now is forming around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, the town. Um, so I know this was like a big deal on the net. An entire Russian battalion has been destroyed. 180 losses. I've listened to several people talk about this, including a BBC report with a British military specialist who was examining the photos, Jacob Dreisen's analysis of the whole thing, and also Alexander Mercurius, who revised his original position on what exactly happened there. So, because we've got a big show, I'm not going to delve too deep into what each of these ideas were. Basically, what it looks like is there was an attempted crossing by the Russians and the Ukrainians, somewhere relatively in the same area, and that there were heavy losses, not just for the Ukrainians, but also very much for the Russians. Um, when I first looked at the photos, I didn't realize that all the photos were actually Ukrainian from a Ukrainian drone, and that they were published in Ukrainian websites and so on and newspapers. The reason I'm hesitant to believe them is, frankly, there have been so many lies on their part, and there's been such a desperate need for PR victories that I'm hesitant. Now, there was recently a retired um, American general who published literally an image from the video game Arma, where two Russian jets are blown out of the sky on his Twitter. Like,
Yes,
it's this.
I remember seeing that,
You know the
and
one I'm talking. He's got a
and
Scottish last name, McCarthy or something. I forget. It's been
something
a few
along that
days.
lines.
Yeah. So um, now what it looks like, because the theory went back and forth, and I've read other people and what they have to say, is there's a it's possible that this is a composite of images. I don't mean necessarily that they're superimposed, that this might be an area where the forces had gone, like one side tried, failed, and then the other side tried to cross it as well, probably because this is an area where the river is quite narrow and the crossing would be easier to do so there. The carnage of material is huge, but surprisingly, there are no images of bodies. Now, in Ukrainian media, they were saying an entire battalion was wiped out, over 300 men, but there's no bodies. And it would take a considerable amount of time to clear all those bodies, right? You have some other oddities, right? You have oddities where you'll see a destroyed vehicle and you'll see another vehicle next to it that isn't destroyed. which is quite weird. You'll see other vehicles
Hey,
where the
maybe it
top
just
is
ran out of
popped up.
gas.
It's possible, but yeah, I mean, um, so there's, you know, there is some spinning going on here. Now, the Russians have been very reluctant. They have like this daily briefing of their accomplishments, which are very specific to like one theater. Well, they'll say we launched this many missiles, it hit this many targets in this area of Ukraine, and that's all.
Yes, and
There's really,
you'll actually notice, just to interject again, very similar reports about the war in Syria. Whenever there are interceptions of Israeli strikes, they claim that they had knocked down however many Israeli missiles from the Syrian air defenses. So this is pretty similar in that regard, where the number probably isn't fabricated, but it's exaggerated, let's just say.
yes, it could be. It could be. Uh, Sometimes the missiles that are launched are incredibly ineffective, and you might have to agree with them that in various instances they are telling the truth, or they did knock out that many, or maybe Israel did not have a very successful run, or the interception was fairly successful, and so on and so on and so on. Um, but the British analyst predicted something like 180 losses. The Russians have said nothing about this. Some Russian analysts have said about 50. I don't know if the number is somewhere in between. The other thing I noticed is there is a Telegram channel that I have gone to check out, and the name it's called Fake News, and they have a little thing on this, a little write up, and they also have a link to a video by a Russian analyst. I'll post that once the premiere is put up, and you can see that if we're talking about the same area, there's like people walking around. So these are not stills. These are not like a video capture still. This is an actual video. And so there's growing doubt about what exactly happened there. One Ukrainian site claimed 73 vehicles, but if you count every vehicle, there's about 44. Definitely not 73. Another one claimed there was like over 150. So they're greatly exaggerated. There's also a vehicle that looks like it's one of these armored personnel carriers, but they have the tracks like a tank, so they're more heavy duty, and they have this big bulge at the back, which is like it's an ambulance, and only the Ukrainians use this. And that's the other thing is, um, a lot of the equipment is very old equipment that only the Ukrainians and the Lugansk People's Republics use. And the problem, of course, is, from day one in this war, it's been very easy to say, uh, you know, uh, this was a scene of carnage. The Russians were wiped out here. It takes like a special eye to figure out like who could have been that like lost equipment there. So you take something like a T-64. Remember there was that Ukrainian guy who, went inside a tank and took out part of a corpse of somebody who was in the tank and then like boiled it and ate it. Like
Yes, yes, I do.
I'll get into it later, but
Yeah,
this is
he
sort of
claimed to be starving, and
the
then
kind of depravity of a lot of Ukrainians that we're seeing right now. I'll get into that more later with other examples, but um, now the thing is that was a T-64, and as I'm told, the wheels on a T-64 compared to a T-72, they're thinner. There's a difference with the tracks. However, it still gets complicated because, I mean, the case I'm talking about here, it happened around Kiev, and no People's Militia was in that area, right? So if it's a T-64 in that area, most likely that's a Ukrainian vehicle. If it's a T-64, however, in the Donetsk and Lugansk area, or just slightly outside of it, then I don't know. Whose is it? Uh, just today, three T-64s were captured by the Lugansk People's Republic from the Ukrainians, even though it doesn't fire shells that are as capable and armor piercing as the T-72s and T-80s, right? And even though T-64s don't have as good armor overall, although the active armor on the outside can compensate for that because you can get it, you can get active armor. Those are those square things that you see on all the, Russian and Ukrainian tanks. Each square has two plates, one at an angle and one flat. And that's basically to make the projectile explode before it starts hitting the main body of the tank. That's what they do. That's their form of active armor. An Abrams, it's all unified. It's all within one thing. They don't stick out, right? It's part of the armor itself. So, to get back to this river crossing, so there's strange anomalies. You don't see any bodies. If there were over 300 killed, you would see a lot of bodies. The Ukrainians would be very eager to show you all the bodies. They'd love you to see that. There aren't any bodies, and we know that the Russians do clear out the bodies. They even clear out Ukrainian bodies and bury them, but the Ukrainians don't. And I've seen videos where Ukrainians have taken Russian corpses and stripped them and formed them into the shape of the letter Z, right? So this kind of depravity of the Ukrainians has always been there. I like I said, I've seen videos of the kind of shit that they did even back in 2014. So I guess the last thing I'll say about this river crossing is because there was an attempt the next day by the Ukrainians, and it too was not successful. But there was an attempt before the Russian attempt that wasn't successful. So it's a contested area. It's a very difficult thing, and maybe one of the most insightful things that Jacob Dryden said is it looks like artillery hit this area based on what he saw in the photos, and that it's coming from one of the villages. I forget the name now. And his idea was the Russians don't want to hit those villages, and the Ukrainians are placing their artillery in there, so it's very hard to hit them. And it's close enough, and I would assume the village is Belagovorovka. So maybe that's what happened. This might be one of those instances where we never know for sure exactly what happened. I will say that the losses on the Russians, based on the photos, like even if I take away a certain amount of those vehicles belonging to the Ukrainians, I would say, the losses are probably bigger than what the Ukrainians suffered at Snake Island, right? But so I'll put that to rest. That's my final word on what has happened there. So at first, there was no conflation of images. Now it looks like there probably was, and that's based on just the way Ukraine has handled this war, and that so many of the vehicles are vehicles that are used both by the LPR and the Ukrainians, but are not used by the Russians. So I guess this is the really big story as far as Ukraine is concerned, and that is Mariupol and the surrender of the Azov battalion.
Like, I
And
have it on
the
good
Marines.
Ukrainian authority that it was a completion of the military operation, which means it was a success, much in the same way the Afghanistan war was a success. I will have you know.
Yeah,
That has been reported
Azov.
on, but do continue.
Well, so Azov has taken over several Russian ambulances and forced them to drive them to Rostov-on-Don, so they can get medical treatment. And Russian doctors are performing those procedures now. Yeah, so I was shocked by the news, but I knew after the initial group that left. So initially there were about 10 men who surrendered, and then there was another trickle. And at the end of these few hours, about 246 or 250 roughly men had left, most of them wounded one way or another. The men who carried them out on stretchers, of course, could. That isn't to say that maybe they weren't wounded, but they didn't have any serious injuries or wounds. When I saw that happen, I thought, like, this is it. I think we're going to see like a mass surrender. And the next day there was at least 735. The next day after that, about 900. I've seen 2 or 3 different sources. They're saying overall surrender from the Azovstal steelworks is about 1,700. Some say 1,750, but as of Thursday, May the 19th, we can say about 17, give or take, let's say 100, which is a sizable amount. Now, the thing is, apparently, there are still more men in there that have not surrendered. And I mean, this would be an amazing sci-fi film, right? Like, there's an alien down there. And okay, I won't get into it. But you have the 2 leaders of Azov, Kalina and what's the other, Volina. So Kalina apparently had, he did surrender at around 11 at night. This would be on the Wednesday. People are going to be hearing this on the Friday. I'm presuming he did that because he didn't want to be seen surrendering. But Volina, which is the leaner guy with the lighter hair, he hasn't surrendered yet. And who knows? Like, I wonder if he, I don't know, did he commit suicide? Did he escape? But apparently, some sources are saying, because the thing is there's all kinds of people like saying all kinds of nonsense. I mean, this war has been like one of the most biggest disinfo wars I've ever encountered in my life. There's nothing like this to happen. Nothing, not even remotely. So Volina has not come out yet, and he very well may by tomorrow. The thing is the other thing I thought about is after the first 10 who left, and it looks like it was a separate decision on their part, because after another 230, 40 left, right, then you got the leadership of Azov basically taking command and saying, yes, we are going to leave. The mission has been successful. And so on and so on. And then a few hours later, Zelensky said that it's important to save the lives of the heroes, and so on and so on. All you saw up until this moment is stuff about, like, they made videos down there, we're going to fight to the death. And it was very believable. And, some of them did fight to their deaths. You see these poor people with like amputated limbs. I say poor people. I know that many of them have done atrocities in Mariupol for a long time, and now there's more and more evidence indicating that Canadian military was training Azov in Mariupol. So more of that will eventually come out. However, you can't help but have pity for them to some level. Especially because I don't, like, just imagine how, the limb had to be removed, and it's just, it's gruesome to think about it. But the talk was that, they were not going to surrender, and now they have. And now you got to think about morale, right? If the first 10 leave, will there be more? There was more. The next day there were hundreds more, and the next day there was even a little bit more than that. And what is that doing to the morale up in the theater up in Donetsk? Mariupol is in Donetsk, but it's the southern extreme along the Azov Sea. But you go further north to the territory that the Donetsk people are trying to take around the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. Right behind that front, okay, is where you have Slavyansk and Bakhmat. I believe it's called Bakhmat. There's another word that comes in front of it. It's very hard to keep remember all these villages. So now we're beginning to see surrenders there. We're even seeing videos by Ukrainians saying, our officers left us. We cannot keep fighting. We don't have enough supplies, and so on and so on. Many of them have made testimonies who have been captured that indicate, you know, that is the case. These aren't rumors. They're not getting the supplies, and a lot of people who are thinking like Russia has to take all of Ukraine. I mean, I've always said that I never thought that Russia would or wanted to. I frankly don't believe that they at least for the short term, they're not capable of either creating a mobilized unit. Okay, part of the reason this can be deduced is they made another attempt to retake territory in Zaporozhye, which is the area between Mariupol and Kherson, and that was not successful. But more importantly, to the north around Izium, remember when I said Izium was a very hard battle, but after they took it, a salient started to form, and that salient now has started to spread out and begin encircling other areas. And that is what happened with Popasna. They capture it. It's a salient. It breaks. It juts out from the contour of the front line, and then it starts to spread out. Well, the Ukrainian attempt to retake Izium did not succeed. This too required, as we said earlier, a pontoon crossing. And even the area north of Kharkiv, the Russians have been able to take 2 villages now, retake villages. However, again, I'm very disappointed with the Russians when it comes to civilians in this case, because an elderly woman was taken by Ukrainian forces for collaborating with the enemy, which is like ridiculous. This is like a little old lady. We don't know what happened there. Like, I mean, she can be tried, like based on how they, they've treated prisoners. I'm not always so sure that they will treat her fairly. In any case, if you take a village and you're going to leave, and within 48 hours, you have to give people the ability to evacuate with you. I think that's a humane thing. I don't know. Maybe they asked, and the people said that don't worry about it. I don't know. I can't confirm it one way or another. But that is what happened in Bucha and Irpin, and like it's a tragedy, because we know the reprisals that will be meted out.
And you brought up Kharkiv, which reminds me of a admittedly small story I saw, but I think paints a larger picture. And that is during one of the Russian pullbacks, one of the Russian retreats, you had the Ukrainian forces move back in. There was the toppling of a statue of Alexander Nevsky, who was one of the medieval Rus princes who I believe the story is he was a Mongol tributary who fought off a Teutonic German invasion and then later fought against the Mongols. But point being is very renowned figure, national hero status in Russia. I believe you say that every Orthodox majority country has a temple
Yeah, there's one in
dedicated to him.
Bulgaria.
Yes, a canonized saint, everything that comes with that. And they had pulled down that statue, and he was one of the titles he held was one of the princes of Kiev. I don't remember the exact title. I don't think he was like Grand Prince or whatever. Correct me if I'm wrong, but point being is they toppled this statue because it is a sign of Russian occupation there. It's a sign of Russian imperialism, whatever. Which goes back, and
It's
we were discussing this before the show,
yeah,
contradicts the origins of Ukrainian nationalism. This entire conflict is contradicting the origins of Ukrainian nationalism because the claims of
great point.
Ukrainian nationalists since the 18th and more appropriately 19th century have been, we are the true descendants of the Rus. We are the true Kievan Rus. The Moscows, the people from Moscow, are Asiatic pretenders who have stolen our history and stolen our culture and achievements and pretend to be us, while we are currently under their yoke. And even you said, I didn't realize this, Yanukovych, the purported pro-Russia president of Ukraine, claimed that,
No, no, not Yanukovych. Viktor Yushchenko.
oh, you said, yeah, I
Oh,
thought,
did I?
I was confused
Because
by
they're
that.
both named Victor. It's
I,
Viktor
I, I was,
Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko.
okay, so Yushchenko said that Ukraine stretched all the way up to Novgorod because
Yeah,
being under Kiev means it is Ukrainian. Now, for those who know something about the Russian national mythology, they also claim Kiev as the mother of Russian cities, where the Russian claim says that, well, the Rus, the Russians back then, eventually spread out. They built their capital in Moscow because of events particularly related to the Mongols, and they united as one polity under the Muscovite state, later with the capital of St. Petersburg under the Empire, etc., etc. But the Ukrainian claims has always been that those so-called Rus to the east have been pretenders, that they're part Mongols. Again, all that sort of stuff. But it's gotten to the point where, and you even see this with, I know Azov is a bit more so-called fringe, but where they'll have the Viking relics and the Odin statues and those
yeah,
things, where they've completely forsaken their own identity, even as we was Rus, as it were, and decide they want to LARP either as Germanic pagans or Vikings. Now, I don't know how widespread this is in the entirety of Ukraine or the entirety of the Ukrainian people, but it is growing to the point where Ukraine has almost cut off their nose to spite their face. And in this case, being that they are so desperate to spite the Russians that they will reject the own core claims of what they purport to be their national identity.
right. And the interview that I was talking to you about off air about Viktor Yushchenko, that took place like I think 2008, right? Um, yeah, 2008, 2009, somewhere around there. And early on, when the war started in 2014, like that was the kind of thing that, and I was in various, I was in two chats with hardcore Ukrainian nationalists, and what you said is what they said, right? And now they seem to be giving up on that. And there was footage from one of the compounds that the Azov Brigade had battalion had created, and on the wall were these Viking shields with that lightning, that German lightning sign, right? And I'm going like, really, you guys are you're using Viking shields? Like, I know there were Vikings there at one time, but this is like so obscure. You don't speak any Norse language. Your DNA is almost identical to Russian. Like, what are you doing? And so there's this kind of simping. It's like that old joke, the the Balts are are the truest Germans. But you see other examples of this kind of this kind of rage and depravity. And it's not just a video of, say, a Russian soldier that they've executed and the guy's stabbing his face after he's executed him. I mean, mercifully, he's dead, because I've seen videos where they've gouged out a guy's eye. Um, but I would say, for instance, when the Azov guys were transported to hospitals to get their wounds treated, there were pictures that were published of Russian soldiers in the hallways of the hospital who are there to guard, who were sleeping on the floor because there's nowhere else for them to sleep. They're taking a break, right? It's a highly stressful situation. I'm sure they're working around the clock. And you just see this hallway with these Russian soldiers lying down, and the Ukrainians are like mocking them for it. And it's like, just like, why, like, I don't understand how this could be funny. This, like, it's not funny. Like, they're taking a break. They're making sure, like, your co-ethnics are like treated well, and getting their wounds treated so that they don't die of infection. I don't know why is this funny. And then you have the story of that Russian newswoman on when the war broke out, and she brought up a sign, no war, no war in Ukraine, blah blah blah. And so she fled, or not, she didn't, she quit or was fired, and she immediately got a job in Germany for Bild. And of course, the Ukrainians went mental. So for them, here's this woman, Russian, who embarrassed, like, the Russian government, the whole thing, brings out a sign live on Russian news right at the beginning of the war, which is when you would want it the most. But because she is still Russian, no matter how helpful and empathetic she was, they demanded that she be fired. Now, I think she's actually left, but her family won't take her back, and her son has called her a traitor.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
it's a complete case of being completely disowned by her family over
Yeah,
one political stunt to appease people who hate her anyway.
yeah. Like, I just can't picture right now. I cannot picture another group of people that would do this, because they would have protests every day in front of this news organization in Germany, right? Demanding that she be fired because she's Russian. I mean, we've had Russian blue cats that were disqualified from competing. Uh, Russian dogs like the Borzoi and the Siberian Husky from competing. Like, just insane stuff. Um, uh, a Swedish orchestra could not play the balalaika because that was a Russian instrument. Like, Russian trees were disqualified from tree competitions. Just levels of insanity, right? And this is what I mean. Like, there is a genocidal streak within them. Um, that is how angry they are. That they cannot even accept someone who's empathetic to them.
And it does make you wonder in terms of the shift, at least in parts of Ukraine, regarding that national mythology. If they can see the way the winds are blowing and thinking, well, if they're going to treat Russia like this in any significant position of power, we clearly see that they do not like this culture, they do not like these people, and that, in a way, if we're claiming that they're the usurpers and we're the true ones, if we keep this up, as soon as our usefulness dries up, we're probably not going to be uh, considered too favorable in their eyes, and maybe seek again these other identities such as the Viking identity or the Germanic identity or just any of these other things that they pull out because they realize, and you can see the way that they've, for example, the EU has treated Poland. Now, of course, it is West Slavic culture, so there's some different, but point being is they are, and I know that I'll probably get fired from all directions from certain people if I do say this. In many ways, similar nations. These, let's say, less liberal Slavic nations that are at least culturally Christian, if maybe not the most devout populations, at least it's something ingrained within their culture. And of course, they don't like the LGBTQ CIA stuff. All of this, all those things that would make them, let's just say, unfavorable to the current global regime, at least emanating from the West. And again, maybe you could see that with the way it's going, but I think that's probably part of it. But once again, it goes back to this deconstruction of identity both by the Ukrainians and even by the West, to the point where anything that can be even tangentially associated with Russia, even if it's completely apolitical, even if just anything, you will see this. You will see this reaction, and there were some cases. Apparently, there was some federal agents who were surveying some Russian Orthodox church outside of Russia churches, which again, that's the
Yeah, yeah.
foreign branch of the Russian Orthodox Church. The way it works, of course, in the West, because there's no real jurisdictional unity, because there's so many different groups, and most of them are recent arrivals, at least within the past century. It's not unified. Again, I won't get into the exact details of that, but point being is, Russian Orthodox churches abroad, at least in the case of the United States, we have 2 verified cases of them being surveyed by federal agents. So pretty much anything that can be associated with Russia is now on a blacklist.
Right, right. Which is, again, I think what the West is trying to do is harnessing the energy and the attitude amongst Ukrainians towards Russians, and they're trying to spread that out throughout the West, right? In whatever way they can, by legitimizing just some of the stupidest things, as I just mentioned, by not criticizing them, by not pushing back, by not mocking it. So, but when this war started, I said that Putin would make a kind of a demarcation line between Russia and Ukraine. That after the last 8 years, he really has no choice. That has to happen. The line may not be perfect. Not everybody may be included that could be included, but that line is going to be redrawn. And in many ways, this is being mirrored with the way Ukrainians think about their identity. And you're seeing now they're jettisoning, like, not only are they, they're LARPing so much as mid-century Germans, when you look at their paraphernalia and so on. There's a photo in a bookstore from 2020, and it's a guy who's like literally dressed up as like in a Nazi uniform in a bookstore in Kherson, of all places. Um, Part of that is intimidation, of course, right? But there's now, I don't know if it's going to be reversed, but they are jettisoning even anything that they once held in common with the Russians. So in the same way that Putin is demarcating a line about where like Russia proper is and separate from Ukraine, Ukraine is doing the same thing with developing their national identity, because it is a new ethnogenesis that has formed in that region over centuries. And now they're sort of in a position where they, in search of authenticity, they have to um, create a I don't want to say folklore, because that would mean it's inauthentic. So I don't mean it in that way when I say folklore. But they do have to find more depth than like just World War II. And it seems like totems to Pirin and maybe even Odin. That's sort of more, how can I put it? Um, that's more rare, and that's basically with like groups like Azov. But there are others like S14, Tornado, uh, Idar. Actually, the leader of Idar got captured as well. Um, Idar were even bigger scums than Azov, but anyhow, I'm all over the place. So they're trying to find depth, and the way they're trying to find depth is by cutting a line with Russia and what past they share with them. They're seizing more and more churches of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They want to create. They've already have created their own national Ukrainian church. So I just think it's going to keep going this way. They are going to delineate themselves in some way, separate from Russia. They're forming their own antibodies to this, to Russia, as a way to do it. And you're looking at like a very early kind of ethnogenesis, because like a lot of their identity is based in, as an origin story, is very recent stuff,
And
with the exception of the Vikings thing. But they're not Vikings.
yes, and you can point to the Viking rule over Rus and that there were Viking princes, but that doesn't mean that they were ever a Nordic or Scandinavian people. They just so happened to fall under the rule, as happened with many situations in the medieval era where you would have a foreign prince or a foreign king or be under the jurisdiction of some emperor hundreds of miles away. And with all that being said, the last thing I have about Ukraine is that the Senate has agreed to send the most recent $40 billion aid package that was delayed. Now, you'll recall it was delayed by Rand Paul, who simply questioned, well, what's aid going for? What are the exact details of this? And more or less wanted an audit of how those funds would be used. Of course, he never got that, and it was approved by the Senate today, and we have moved forward with that aid package being sent out. So they're just throwing more money into the system. I don't know what they're hoping to accomplish. I don't know how much longer they actually want to prolong this war, but that is what we are looking at right now with the Ukraine situation. So the cash flow from the West is still continuing. I imagine on top of the American 40 billion from the various European countries and various other Western countries, that several billion more will also be flowing into Ukraine in the near future. But at this rate, I mean, you already have the withdrawals from Mariupol, and you have, as we said a few weeks ago, the activation of the territorial defense units, which are these really scraping bottom of the barrel units. You had the conscription drive that had mixed results, and you recall, in the far western reaches of Ukraine, in that I believe it was Zakarpattia, which has the large ethnic Hungarian population and the large Ruthenian population or Rusin population. There was resistance to that conscription drive. So when it comes to the war effort in Ukraine, no matter what you can say about Russia's blunders, and yes, there has been, one could point to their war effort, and I certainly wouldn't dispute any of it and say that it has been suboptimal compared to what I think many of us, in even the so-called experts, were expecting. But for whatever blunders and follies the Russians have had, that doesn't mean the Ukrainians have done well in this war and have arguably also fared worse. So it's just a matter of how much longer will the fighting keep up, how much longer can morale be maintained among Ukrainian forces in order to keep this war effort at full steam ahead. And those are questions I honestly do not have the answer to at this time.
Right. One of the things you haven't seen in about a month are like captured Russian POWs. You very rarely see anything like that. You see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian POWs now, and they're gradually losing village by village. Right now, Severodonetsk is cut off essentially. They're attacking it from three sides. The fourth side, um, Ukrainians have blown up a bridge that could have let them out. Um, but that was in order to stop the push from the south, from Popasnaya towards Severodonetsk, the town, not Severodonetsk, the river, although there is a river around there, and Lysychansk. Now, they are unconfirmed reports that the command centers there want to pull out, that they can't hope to withstand the pressure from the Russians much longer. The Russians have gone very slow intentionally. They have dramatically reduced their losses. Ukrainian losses, on the other hand, are very high right now, and their morale is not up there. It's just not. The Russians still enjoy taking out command centers, and also um, basically training grounds all throughout Ukraine. For instance, that one just outside of Lviv, which was hit, I believe, on March the 13th, has been hit again. There have been others. I just can't remember all their names because honestly, there is so much stuff happening in Ukraine right now. And I think that's why the Russians are okay with going at this pace, even if the rest of the world isn't okay with it, or they look at it as a sign of weakness. Um, I think most experts agree that Donetsk and Lugansk are going to be completely liberated. And what happens after that is, I think, uncertain. The capacity, like take for instance, trying to rearm Ukraine. Let's say with the artillery pieces from the U.S., like the M777, right? So two of them, I saw video footage of two of them that got destroyed today. Um, but two is not enough. Now, America sent out about 95. Canada sent out a few. There was about 100, 105 that were delivered. How are you going to get them across all the way to the east from the west, right? You can't, any convoy is going to be noticed, even at night. These areas are monitored, right? At night is when the Air Force is really active and starts bombing these centers, or anything that is moving on the road. So yeah, there are no Russian troops there, but the Russians own the sky, and Ukraine cannot hope to replenish quickly enough. So essentially, what they're doing is, uh, they're throwing these young men into a death trap, trying to hold on to Donetsk and Lugansk. Now, I know why morally it's important for them to do that, because they ceded Crimea. They for for 8 years they had to cede um, parts of Lugansk and Donetsk. Like the People's Republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, they never controlled more than 50% of those territories. So they controlled a very, very small amount. It's far smaller than the size of Crimea, just to put things into perspective. Um, but they still, weren't able to take it all back. A part of this is the way those republics were able to defeat the Ukrainians in Ilovaisk and in Debaltsevo. So, Debaltsevo, some people speculate there were like 8,000 Ukrainian troops. There were at least close to 1,000 prisoners. They counted over 1,000 dead on the streets. Like the Baltzevo was a very brutal battle, and so a portion of them, a good portion of them, got out. But in Ilovaisk, which is just south of Donetsk, but southeast, not like south the way Mariupol is. It's a bit tucked behind Donetsk, the city, right? So the Ukrainians got trapped there because they took over half the city, but they couldn't take over the part that had the command center in the town. When you look at the videos, like the equipment is like even older than the stuff that they're using now. They're using the big Soviet helmets. There's far fewer fighters, but nonetheless, right? There were like still several thousands of Ukrainians that went there. They tried to get out, and they wanted these incredible conditions. You let us out with our guns, and that's the deal. And they're like, the Donetsk people are going, no, you're going to put down your guns and you're going to leave the territory. So it all came down to keeping the guns. They decided to keep the guns, and they were annihilated. I remember articles about this, about the cruelty of the separatists, for shooting at these guys who were leaving, but they're leaving with their guns. You know, um, there is no way the Ukrainians would have been um, kind enough to let the separatists leave the same way if they too got trapped in a city. That would never have happened.
Well,
So
speaking
it's
of outrageous demands, I suppose we do have some news about NATO as well.
yes, yes. Sorry, I'm going off with
Oh, it's no problem.
2014 lore.
There was simply a lot to cover here, but with that being said, we have the dispute over Finnish and Swedish NATO membership. Now, this particularly comes down to Finnish NATO membership, as they are the primary one. And my general theory about Finland's NATO membership is they're in Brussels. The top strategic minds in the world, as we're told, are looking at the situation with Russia, and they think, what is the only way to stop a bad guy with an Asiatic horde? And then they come to the realization, a good guy with an Asiatic horde, get Finland on the phone. But with that being said, Finland, of course, has been being one of the
I mean,
former.
guys, we're joking. I hope
Yes,
I
yes.
know our listeners know.
But yes, putting the qualifier out there. Finland has been on the fence about NATO for years. Now, of course, during the Cold War. Now, I did have a power outage, so the first hour or so, the first 50 minutes or so, right before we're about to talk about NATO, it cut off there. However, I was able to salvage it. I was able to repair that file, so these are two files fused together. And we are going to continue the episode, the second half or so. This might be a little bit of a longer episode, so thank you for bearing with us. But there were just a couple of updates on Ukraine, such as the full surrender of Avastal did take place between yesterday and today, and we do have some more news about NATO that's more up to date, but we were discussing NATO, and once again, just to clarify in case this got cut off, the Asiatic horde thing was a joke. So please, please don't get too upset about that if you're
It's
very
just bants.
simple as. And with that being said, trust me, they are not the only ethnic group that has faced the our ire on the show. My own people, the Italians, have gotten plenty of that. The Mediterraneans have not been spared on the show. We've given them favorable treatment, but they have not been spared. But with that being said, we do have the ascension of Sweden and Finland into NATO on the table. That is something that is a distinct possibility. However, for the time being, it is being stonewalled by Turkey, who are making. You have Erdogan making some interesting demands, to say the least, and that's, of course, on top of holdouts with Croatia, with the president Milanovic, who is actually going against what the Croatian parliament wants to do. The Croatian parliament is pro-NATO expansion in this case. Hungary is on the fence. Orban, for example, voiced some support for it. However, that was also coupled with him opposing the new expanded EU sanctions, in which case we'll get into some of the news about the European Union in a couple minutes here. But thus far, the current demands we have from Turkey regarding ascension into NATO, and you'll see what we mean by a bit of absurd points. So, number one, NATO should classify not only the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, but also the Syrian Defense Force, SDF, and the terrorist organization, which they abbreviate to FETO, in the alliance list of threats. The United States should extradite Pennsylvania-based dissident cleric Fethullah Gulen to Turkey. Those of you who recall the coup, that was the person that Erdogan primarily laid the blame on, was Gulen, and said that it was actually an American orchestrated coup by him up in his Pennsylvania mountain mansion. You'll recall that they demanded his extradition. In fact, I think it was the one missionary worker pastor that they ended up giving time served and released a few years back. I believed they tried to use him as leverage for something of a prisoner exchange. And that also includes all NATO members, including Sweden and Finland, must cease any activity by the PKK, SDF, or FETO in their territory. That would include the United States and, of course, their efforts in Syria. The United States and all other NATO bodies must lift all sanctions related to Turkey's purchase of S-400s, including the sanctions upon the Turkish Defense Industry Directorate. And then Turkey would not only receive new F-16 upgrade kits for existing fleets, but Turkey would also be able to rejoin the F-35 program, which it was expelled from for activating the Russian S-400s. And lastly, the United States will cease preventing Turkey from exporting military products containing Western components. Now, the realistic picture of those demands is I do not believe they will be met, and I do not believe that Erdogan or anyone within the Turkish regime believes they will be met. They are an initial offer. They are a high bargain. They're hoping to squeeze something out of this. They're hoping to squeeze something out of the U.S., out of NATO, out of the major players in Europe. But I don't think they expect all of those, or even one of those, to be met. Much smaller demands they're probably realistically asking for, but they're coming in high. They are demanding this, this, and this, and they are playing hardball. Turkey realizes its position in NATO. They will likely get some concession unless the Biden administration, unless the talking heads at NATO in Brussels decide that they're done playing the Turkish games, which, again, something you have to keep in mind. With NATO's current mission, and even its initial mission, Turkey is the key player there. Now, of course, you can say the Americans bring in the military power, they are the world superpower backing the alliance, but aside from America, Turkey is the most important member. They have the second largest military in NATO, and but what it really comes down to is their geography. They are positioned right under Russia and right on the Black Sea. They are the key component to this entire thing working. And honestly, I've said for years, I've hoped for years, that NATO expels Turkey and destroys itself. Because that would destroy NATO if they expelled Turkey.
Yeah.
And it's funny because you get these smaller countries like Greece or sometimes like Bulgaria or like these smaller Balkan countries who I don't think quite understand what's at play. At least some of the talking heads there don't quite understand what's at play when they ask or demand that Turkey be removed from NATO, not realizing that, again, they're the entire crux of the alliance. And I think it should be a lesson to these countries, and maybe this is part of the reason they can't see it, that although Turkey doesn't always get everything it wants, they are still like key players, so they get a lot of incentives to stay within NATO and play the game. That any one of those countries could find themselves on the receiving end of those demands and be strong armed or encouraged, so called, by the United States, by France, UK, one of these major players. Maybe not France so much. Again, we can get into French Turkish relations at a later time here. But point being is, either from Washington or Brussels, they may feel the pressure to acquiesce to Turkish demands to the point where it should be a lesson, again, especially for countries like Greece in particular comes to mind, but others as well, others in that Balkan region bordering Turkey, Bulgaria, so forth, that at the end of the day, Turkey's interests will trump this. There's a reason why Turkey was allowed to buy the S-400s and face little to no consequence in the first place. Again, the worst punishment they got was no F-35. They got sanctions for an unrelated reason. Keep that in mind. And really, they are in the best of both worlds right now. They have a working relationship with Russia, so to speak. They
Mhm.
have NATO wrapped around their finger. They still even play this game with the European Union. Now, Germany isn't nearly as conciliatory ever since Merkel left office, but again, you have these players in Europe who are willing to give Turkey very special treatment. And that's not to mention the role that they play in the energy trade, such as, of course, there are pipelines that go through Turkey connected to both Azerbaijan and Russia. They had that energy project that they wanted to do via Libya. And again, at the end of the day, they do get to call a lot of the shots when it comes to NATO. And like I said, out of that really tall order that they just gave to Brussels, I don't expect any of those points to be met, but I do expect some sweetening of the pot in order to get them to accept Swedish and Finnish membership. Not that Sweden and Finland are the key to a NATO victory in this proxy conflict, but the expansion, adding new states, is a boost in legitimacy. It does at least present the image that NATO is strong, that it can grow, that it can incorporate new members. So they're desperate to get new members as a PR stunt more than anything. But right now, the main country that's stonewalling that is Turkey, and then we can get into a bit of the Croatia one because I haven't really pegged down what the current Croatian president Milanovic's motives are for wanting to stonewall this. You recall that Croatia, throughout the duration of this conflict, and even in the lead up to it, has been one of the more hesitant parties, which may surprise some. They may have saw it as a country like Poland, where it'd be very gung ho about these sort of things. Of course, plenty of Croatian volunteers ever since 2014 have gone to fight for the Ukrainian side in the Donbass war, and I believe even quite a few Croatian volunteers have gone with the outbreak of actual war with Russia in the recent months. But Croatia's president, even against the parliament, and I'm pretty sure even against the prime minister at this point, does not want to move forward with it at this point. There is a great deal of hesitation, and this has been consistent with Croatia over the past few years, whether that comes to the European Union, NATO, etc., where a country that it's not exactly pro-Russia, it's not a country you'd think of it. Many would, like, once again, I said compare it to Poland, but they've been very hesitant to go along with the empire's demands in the last few years. And of course, just for some of Milanovic's background, he's been in office since 2020. He's technically an independent. He broke from the Social Democratic Party. And again, I can't really peg down a political angle. I don't really see any ties, even financially, between him or Russia or anyone in Russia that would do this. I mean, but it could just come down to a matter of they don't want to antagonize Russia further because of the same reason, say, Germany and Italy just approved the Russian rubles for energy deal. And again, we'll get into some of that thing in a minute
Yeah.
when we talk more about the energy crisis side of things. But at the end of the day, NATO, which has supposedly never been more united, has these major holdouts. Again, very few people are surprised by Turkey, but you're getting even some murmurs of dissent in other countries. And funny enough, this is one of the ones where it seems, for the time being, seems like Orban has drifted more pro-West. But again, that's also coupled with him opposing the new EU sanctions package and being a pain to Brussels there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll begin with Turkey to unpack this, and I think once I do, some of the reasons why Milanovic of Croatia and his opposition to Finland and Sweden joining NATO will be, I think, clarified. So the the sweet spot that Turkey has developed since Russia entered the war in Syria is, well, first of all, it's phenomenal because I think what they have done is they have revealed that if they switch sides, that NATO is essentially effed, right? It's not so much that Turkey is not a help, right? Like some of the Kurdish groups that Turkey is fighting against, those are directly funded by the US. There is an unannounced proxy war already taking place between Turkey and America in that regard. The only thing that makes it tolerable is that it's taking place in Syria and that these forces, so far funded by the US, uh, have not sided with Assad in an overwhelming way. Um, they have been able to inflict damage. The last episode we talked about that, but the main on like Turkish regulars, not just like the jihadis that Turkey pays for to fight their proxy war against the Kurds. Um, I think what Turkey is signaling is, you know, there's an emerging alternate world with Russia and China. And if you push me, I'll go there. You don't want to push me. The other thing is that they have pragmatic concerns. So Orban came out and said this week that 50% of Turkey's gas supplies come from Russia. On top of that, they charge transit fees. I think Erdogan is under no illusion that if they do something that would directly spoil everything that Russia is doing in Ukraine, Russia would go nuclear on it and they would cut off gas. That would topple Erdogan, right? We are already now in the we are going to be facing, most likely, unless something happens between now and August, or let's say now and July, a food crisis. And it won't just be in Africa, it will be in Europe and probably North America as well. America is so desperate for this that they have actually, I mean, they're willing to publish this. They are considering lifting sanctions off of Belarus for potash in order to get some fertilizer.
Yes, and in a similar vein, I saw where there was an offer from Putin. I'm not sure how tongue-in-cheek it was, but to send baby formula to the United States due to the current shortages.
So it's a very real concern. I think Turkey absolutely recognizes what its value is in this Russia versus America West conflict. I think it knows absolutely what it's worth. And after the coup, it knows it's disposable. To comply with whatever America wants will not mean that Erdogan will be spared more sanctions. Erdogan, there'll be no attempts on his life again. I think the coup attempt by the US back in 2016 under Obama absolutely straightened out Erdogan.
And you want a more contemporary example, look at Lukashenko. The color
Yeah,
revolution in Belarus came after about a year and a half of cooperation with the West, after he started
right.
to
He
drift
opened
more
up the
westward.
embassy
The
in Minsk
pressure,
for the first time in decades.
yes, they opened the embassy in Minsk. Mike Pompeo went there. It was this whole fanfare. And then that was early summer 2020. And then by August, September 2020, you had a full blown color revolution in Belarus. Now, that one was
Yeah.
put down, but it shows that there is, if you want, if you're anti West and you start to drift towards the West or try to be more conciliatory, you're more likely to face scrutiny because of that. Whereas if you maintain a strong footing both at home and abroad when it comes to the West, even if you do cooperate with them on some matters, again, with the examples being Lukashenko and Erdogan, they're much less likely to cross you because you can just turn east. But once they
Mhm.
isolate you from the east, as it were, you're completely at their mercy. And again,
Yes.
we've seen that happen to Erdogan, we've seen it happen to Lukashenko, and Orban right now is probably taking notes on all of this, finding himself
Oh,
in a
yes.
very similar position to those two men.
Right. Right. I think for Croatia, as far as I know, there are no pipelines that are under the water, under the Mediterranean that lead directly to Croatia. So it's not a landlocked country like Serbia and Hungary and so on. However, it like any embargo, oil or gas, will affect it negatively. But I think they're also concerned about the war spreading because, as we discussed off the air yesterday, you can look at what's happening in Ukraine now as an ongoing war that has not stopped since 1991. It has had four distinct theaters. The first theater was former Yugoslavia, Kosovo. Then came Georgia. You could include Chechnya in
Yeah, I was
that
about to
too.
say just the Caucasus in general with Armenia and Azerbaijan as well.
Right. Yes. So you can look at uh, Yugoslavia, the Caucasus, Ukraine, and Syria. Every one of these places has been at war constantly since 1991. All of them involve Russia and America, right? So these are the four theaters or three theaters of war that have been going on constantly. Um, and what do you see over the last 31 years, right? Russia is still, Russia has not gotten weaker. It's in fact gotten stronger. America has gotten weaker. Um, and of course, we've stressed that in no way does that mean that America is finished. It doesn't have any other tricks up its sleeve. If it wants to, it will still use force. And America's in no hurry to be demoted in its power more than it already has been. However, I think what has happened in the last 31 years are real options have emerged with countries that don't want to play along. Turkey, I think, was well aware, let's say with the war in Iraq, that, we can talk on and on about weapons of mass destruction. Nobody really believed those lies. Then it was for democracy. But the real project, I think, was uh, if not to destroy Iraq, then to liberalize it. There were think tanks prior to the war in 2003, with the big invasion, the second part of the war, that thought that, Iraq is really well, overall, they're really well educated. They're not really that religious compared to other Muslim nations. If we can turn them around, they're going to have a emanating effect within the entire region. It will not only affect Iran, but it will affect maybe Saudi Arabia, right? That didn't work out. And you can always argue because, I think other people more cynically thought, well, just, destroy Iraq and work with the Kurds in the north and, steal the oil, give the oil to Israel, because that's who most of the oil from northern Iraq goes to, or definitely did right at the start of 2000 and sorry, at the end of 2003. So I would say that Turkey is, again, I will just reiterate the point one last time. They're very well aware of the kind of cards that they hold. They're very powerful cards. They are extremely uh, deterministic about what happens in the future. America knows not to push Turkey too far. As long as Turkey doesn't cause too much trouble with the Greeks, Turkey has the upper hand here. And Turkey also recognizes how vulnerable it is. It would be, Erdogan would be scrapped to the side in no time after he gave the Americans what they wanted. He's, in that sense, smarter than what Lukashenko was. Lukashenko escaped by the skin of his teeth. So that's what I'll say. Now, we've noted before that Sweden and Finland have been working closely with NATO ever since the mid 90s, right? All that talk about Finland being a neutral country, it's not a neutral country. Like, what things are said diplomatically for the 6 o'clock news is not the reality. Finns don't like Russians. They have grievances over the territory that they lost in the late 30s. Sweden has been almost always anti-Russia ever since they lost that region that later became St. Petersburg. They were always more empathetic with the Germans in World War II. So I doubt very much that there was ever really some kind of neutrality. It was, their decisions were based in fear of what would happen, because they just witnessed the largest war in human history. So yeah, that's what I'll say about this segment.
Yes, and getting into Finland, you had on May 14th, which is when these proceedings initially happened, Russia had cut off energy supplies to Finland
Yeah.
effective immediately. And in terms of how has that affected Finland so far, we haven't seen anything. But this again gets us in the question of where's this energy going to come from? And you actually had an interesting sequence of events over the past few months here, ever since the start of the war. Now, you recall that the Saudis and the Emiratis both told the U.S. that they were producing at max capacity. So, just over the course of the last 2 months, you've had the Saudis ignore Biden's phone calls, and they have not been very open diplomatically, and that, of course, applies to the other Gulf states, as the Emiratis, etc. And then they turn around and they have Singh, who's within the Biden administration, threaten India. And then on top of that, that's of course over India's refusal to sanction Russia. And you had Blinken come out and say, before any of this scandal with Erdogan, that he was confident they would have Turkish support for NATO expansion. And it just keeps going on, and this is, of course, on top of Biden trying to reconcile with Venezuela to get oil from Latin America, on top of the EU approving the ruble for gas deal, particularly Germany and Italy were in this case. And this was also included just, and this also included Lloyd Austin, the current Secretary of Defense, trying to get Ukraine to agree to some sort of ceasefire after the lead up to the war in the initial stages of the war, saying not 1 inch will be ceded by Ukraine to Russia. And also, to top it all off, you have Berlusconi coming back into the spotlight and saying, let me just get his words here, that Europe needs to convince Zelensky to accept Russian demands in order to end this war. Now, you'll recall that Berlusconi, historically, was friendlier with Russia than most Western leaders would ever be caught doing. Probably the only thing that compares, and if you even want to consider Hungary Western, which I would to an extent, uh, really Orban is the only thing that can really compare in the recent years to Berlusconi's relationship with Russia and Putin in particular. So you have all of that happening. You have NATO and the European Union as supposedly united as ever, and as we mentioned before, you also had Hungary using its power within the European Union to work against this current sanctions package. And again, that is all on top of just really everything that's happened in Ukraine in the past couple of days here. And you're almost at a loss for words because the most recent news that comes out, this is from a Serbian Serbian mutual I have on Twitter, so take his translation however you will. I'll link the article for those of you who can actually read the language. Quote, those who have seized imports can bring oil on tankers. Had they not taken our sea, we too would have a port, Orban said about the seacoast that was currently Croatia, ruled by Hungary, of course, in the past. And this is him talking about the importing of oil through the Adriatic through Croatia. Yet again, just this circumventing of course, uh, Russian, let's just say, um, hardball negotiations with energy. Even though, again, the European Union, Germany, and Italy in particular, have accepted the ruble deal. And you have this happening on top of just everything to the point where, regardless of how Russia has performed in the military aspects of this conflict, if you want to believe the worst projections and the worst analysis of Russian performance in the actual combat, when it comes to the economic side, when it comes to the control of the energy markets, and when it comes to sowing division within NATO, within the West, within the European Union, even if Russia's forces were to collapse in Ukraine tomorrow, they've won in that aspect by far, hands down. To the point where, again, confidence in a so-called unified West is completely shattered. Nobody
Yeah.
believes in it.
Well, Putin announced today that it will be wheat for rubles.
Oh yes, yes. And again, that's getting into what you were saying with some of the food shortages that were coming up. And with that being said, again, the idea of a strong unified West against so-called Russian aggression is completely gone, completely dead. Nobody believes it anymore because so many European nations have so-called appeased Russia or bent the knee to Russia, as some more critical analysis may say. But it is getting closer. Now, I wouldn't say we're even close to an answer, but we are inching closer to an answer to the question, how much pain will Europe tolerate in order to serve the American empire. How much will they put themselves through? How much will they disadvantage themselves in order to meet the demands of Washington and the collaborators of Washington in Brussels, in Paris, in London, in, of course, the usual suspects, as it were.
Right. I mean, I think as far as the operation in Ukraine is going for the Russians right now, it's going quite well. I mean, the Zaporozhye region right now has, just like the Kherson region, has now switched to doing all its transactions in the ruble. And like Kherson, people will be getting their pensions in rubles. That entire chunk of the South, uh, from Crimea all the way to Mariupol on the Russian border, that's a done deal. And you have fighting is already approaching the center of Severodonetsk, the town. Even with setbacks, there was a convoy that was. I'm just going to add a little bit to what you're saying because I only saw this today, and I guess people know that this is a recording that's taken 2 days to do because of the fallout. So there was a column, trucks containing ammo that was hit by two Turkish drones by the Ukrainians. I haven't seen anything so far to confirm this. I have seen the videos and I have seen Russian Twitter accounts that say that this indeed happened. So there were large explosions, which people tend to think means ammo, meaning this is like if this column was attacked in its rear in an area called Kamishevka. Kamishevak. I keep missing it. Anyways, despite all that, there isn't a day, in the Donbass that Ukraine does not lose a village. They don't lose just one; they lose several. So I think Russia right now is content to go at this pace, despite this setback, which was a large loss. And we mentioned that the pontoon crossing probably also meant that there was a large loss. But over 25 of the vehicles are BMP ones, which Russia doesn't use. So it had to have meant that those were Ukrainian or LPR, probably both. They have small turrets. The turrets don't look like the turrets on the more modern BMP4s, BMP3s, and their sub designates, right? Um, so that part is like there's a few tactical setbacks, but Ukraine has lost three towns that it had taken in Kharkov. So the Russians are back now in Kharkov. The whole point of the Ukrainian Kharkov mission wasn't just really for PR, it was to divert attention from Donbass into Kharkov, right? Because they thought that the Russians were going to be so emotionally attached to Kharkov that they would do such a thing, but they didn't because strategically that meant no sense. So the strategy is not just there on the battlefield, the strategy is there economically. And so they are slowly introducing um, punchbacks, you could say, for lack of a better word, retaliation for the for the sanctions that were supposed to destroy Russia back in February. So this wheat for ruble may be even more devastating than gas or oil because Russia and Ukraine have a bigger market share of that globally. Um, this is going to be very, very, very interesting how this pans out, and we're going to see just as you say, how much punishment can Europe take?
Absolutely.
Because
And
Russia is going to have food. Like Russia had a bumper crop, one of its best in the last 5 years. So Russia's not worried about that.
unfortunately, I don't have this map on file, but I believe it was from one of Peter Zahan's many lectures. Now, take him with a grain of salt. He says a lot of things, and I actually haven't kept up with his coverage of the war, but I'm sure even if a lot of it is what I expect it to be, it still probably is interesting. But getting into that, I believe the 5 countries that he said were food sufficient, off the top of my head, 5 or 6 countries. It was the U.S., Canada, France, Argentina, Russia, and Ukraine. I think were the 5 countries that were not only food self-sufficient but able to be exporters. Again, there's a whole map that rates them all with a color-coded scale on how self-sufficient they are, or whether like on how much they depend on imports. But point being is most of Europe is orange and red, where it relies on food imports, so that's something to look at. Much of Africa is orange and red. China is actually orange. Now, they do have an in with Russia, so we can see how that works out. But again, with the way the global market has been shaken up and with the way exports have been affected by this war, as you were saying, I believe you were saying this before, after we started recording, so just to repeat what you were saying, again, you can see these food shortages and dare I even say famines reach not only the blighted areas of Africa and the Middle East, but again, places in East Asia, and even, dare I say, places in the Americas, in North and South America. But with all that being said, we are looking at this, we are looking at the consequences of the globalized economy in a world facing a problem that was unthinkable to most globalists, which is multipolar superpowers vying against each other both directly and indirectly. This was something that was not anticipated by the neoliberal economists of the 90s and 2000s. And even after 9/11, even after that, most people thought, well, the worst threats we're going to be facing are rogue terrorist regimes in the Middle East and Africa,
Dirty
and
bombs.
yeah, yeah, and groups like Al Qaeda or the Taliban. Nobody anticipated. Well,
Groups
correction.
we control.
Yeah, yeah, groups we control. But very few people expected that we would be on this footing with Russia again, that China would be a resurgent power, that we would have such a strained relationship with Europe. Again, these people who, post Cold War, post collapse of the Soviet Union, the people who have charted the course since then did not even anticipate the possibility of anything like this happening, or at least not serious enough to the point where we had any sort of contingency plans for these things to happen. And it
Mhm.
hits back on the at least 2016 Trump rhetoric of a more nationalist economy, a more more domestic industry, more domestic production, more things made in America, more stuff again coming from local areas or at least within the same nation. And I do want to get into some speculation about Trump in light of recent stories and of course his speculated comeback. But I'll spare you from that for now. But again, these ideas that were denounced as populist rhetoric or economically illiterate or even dangerous and fascistic all of a sudden look a lot more appealing, I imagine, to a lot more people, not only in America, but all across the world. The idea that supply chains might be more local or with neighboring countries, or that maybe we shouldn't rely on countries in East Asia to uh, produce pharmaceutical drugs or produce even just going beyond cheap consumer goods, but necessary consumer goods. Or maybe we shouldn't be so reliant on countries like Russia or Ukraine or Belarus for these products that are so integral to agriculture. And once again, I don't know what it was like during the Cold War. I don't imagine that there was too much um, back and forth with that during the Cold War. I know that, of course, the West would send grain shipments to the Soviet Union as part of one of the détente programs. I think that was under Nixon. Correct me if I'm wrong. But point being is, even with the semi-globalized system we had from 45 to 91, there was still some degree of self-sufficiency. Now, we saw from, say, the 60s to the 80s that gradually get chipped away, especially in the United States, as we sent our industry to second and third world countries, or more appropriately, third world countries, in order to bribe them into being pro-West. Again, that's how we bribe these countries with free trade, with these lopsided trade deals that took from the American heartland and gave to some place in Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America. That's really the origin of that. And of course, that was cranked up to 11 once you had the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s with the full push towards globalization. But at the end of the day, what you have here is you find yourself in a situation, well, what happens when that breaks down? What happens when Russia gets into a border war with one of its neighbors in which it's had a long-standing feud with? And they don't have any answers to these questions. And dare I even imagine what a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would do to the supply chains, or what that would even look like. I mean, at this point, if I had to make a speculation, I know this is a bit highbrow. I know I'm getting probably a bit beyond my scope here. But in the next few years, depending on the rate at which the Ukraine war goes and Russia's standing in the world, if China decides to make its move on Taiwan, whether that be militarily or diplomatically or however, I mean, that's checkmate for the West. I don't see any way it recovers, any way the current Western order recovers. Because we already are putting so much pressure on Europe right now to comply with our policies, and even that's not working. They're even against skirting these sanctions, being against these sanctions bills, still importing Russian oil and gas. And then, again, I can't imagine what the twofer would be like if we got a war in East Asia. We already saw what Convid did to the supply chains coming out of China and East Asia. And just as we started to recover from that, we got the war in Eastern Europe. And with this whole, again, new monkey paws, as they call it, who knows what that's going to look like. I'll get into the reason why I call it that in particular as we actually
Yeah,
get into that,
yeah.
because we do also have some Middle Eastern news that we do need to cover. But again, just to really wrap up these points before I hand it over to you, at the end of the day, it's these problems that should have been very easy to anticipate, but nobody anticipated. And really, what's this going to look like? And this is more of a rhetorical question because I think we all know the answer. Who are going to suffer the consequences of these failures?
Right. The overriding idea that you get when you examine the totality of this war in Ukraine, the impact that it's having on the world and Europe, is that the West was not really prepared for this, or that they completely misjudged the situation. I think part of the reason why Western media is obsessed with saying that Russia misjudged Ukraine is because they misjudged Ukraine and Russia, and particularly Russia. Um, a lot of what the West does is actually projection. That's where it gets its propaganda points. Ukraine has been doing it for a very long time, especially in the early part of the war. But even now,
I
there are
mean,
other
never
armed.
underestimate the rhetorical power of a no you. It's worked not only in this current paradigm, not only for this
Yeah.
current empire, but all throughout human history. Seldom has there been more powerful words than no you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the obsession that anytime there's a tactical defeat of Russia, that doesn't change the progression. There's a kind of a celebration. They're like waiting for any kind of hopeful outcome, hopeful, turnaround, and that's not happening. Um, so I think they have completely misjudged Russia. Mind you, Russia still has some money market controls right now about how much money you can withdraw. But judging by support for Putin, which is so high, and for this war, which has thousands of young men wanting to volunteer
Now, mind you,
to
a lot of
go.
these support figures come from a firm out of Poland, which certainly doesn't have the motivation to
Yes,
inflate these numbers at all. Again, a lot of these numbers, of
that's
course,
right.
you'll get the ones out of Russia that are really inflated, like Putin has, like 90+% support. Again, those are probably
Yeah.
exaggerated. But point being is,
83% is
yeah,
not unreasonable. You have anti-Russia polling companies that are saying that indeed is how much support they have.
yeah, and whether they're based out of
Um,
the West or somewhere in Eastern Europe, again, these people who have no motivation to make Putin look better are saying that, yeah, he's that popular.
right. I think they fully understand this is a civilizational war. We brought up in the early part of the show um, how everything that is Russian must be banned. I mean, the latest one is Ukraine has decided to change one of the streets. I believe it's in Kiev. I could be mistaken. Uh, and it's no longer going to be, Pushkin Ulica, Pushkin Street. It's going to be Stephen King Street. The other great writer, Stephen King.
You mean the other great Stefan Ukrainian history that's not Bandera?
Yeah. Yeah, and meanwhile they ignore things like, and in Desna, Ukraine, there was another barracks that was blown up. I mean, these barracks have dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of guys in there, right? Um, so yeah, there's a tremendous miscalculation here. I think they miscalculated Turkey. I think they miscalculated India. Definitely miscalculated Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. I mean, they are just not budging. So, but can America back down? And I don't think America can back down. I think if they back down, that's it. It's like the beginning of the end. You have, um, a loss of confidence. Joe Cole, who does his deep left thing, he did mention one thing in a video that I saw today. He says, America is basically like the Mongol Empire, and all the libertarians who decry the Fed and moving away from the gold standard, they're too entrenched in economic theory. If you look at the Mongol Empire, it produced virtually nothing. It left nothing. It was pure raw power, and it was the threat of violence if you didn't, pay their taxes and obey their money rule. That's how it became successful. But in that is also the possibility of fracture, because, as an empire, it lasted a few centuries, and then corruption and fracturing and everybody wanting their own fiefdom eventually took over. But that's
I believe
where it
the
is right now.
Mongols, when it comes to it, it was only about 3 generations from Genghis Khan to Kublai Khan. I can't even remember what the one in between them was, because
Yeah,
I know Kublai
I
Khan
mean,
was
if
the
you include the
grandson.
Golden Horde and all
Yeah,
and
and
all that,
yeah, and all the
I mean,
fracture
it's not the
states,
same
like,
empire.
but
They're remnants, let's
yes,
say.
yes. But the Mongol Empire proper only lasted just about a century, and before again all the different hordes broke off and became whatever they were. And I'm glad you bring that up because that brings me into something about Trump. Now we've discussed the possible return of Donald Trump to American politics, of course, with the acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk. There are murmurs, and it's probably going to what's end up going to happen is that Trump will be unbanned from Twitter and he will have his platform back. Even on these knockoff social media platforms he's still on, he still pulls quite a bit of numbers. His rallies still pull quite a bit. He'll go out and stump for somebody running for Congress, somebody running for Senate. His endorsements still do decide these primary races. So you have all of that happening. And again, we touched on this a few weeks back, but point being is I believe that what is happening with Donald Trump right now is he has been offered a redemption in the eyes of the regime, as it were. That he can come back, he can reassume his role as president, he can be the
Yeah.
next Grover Cleveland, the guy who got knocked down but came back after the swamp tried to keep him out, and he can keep up all his anti-establishment rhetoric. He can do all the funny Trump stuff that we love, but his primary focus, I believe, will be using him as a quite literal attack dog. He will be used
Yep.
for these overtly aggressive foreign policy decisions, and you even see this in his first term when he was much more of a dissident, so to speak, the closest thing we ever had to a dissident in power in at least the past century, where
Yeah.
he was still the one behind scrapping the INF, behind scrapping the JCPOA, threatening
Yep.
to leave the outer space tree, threatening to leave I believe it was the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the ABM, threatened
Yep.
to leave all these pre-established arms agreements, hawkish on China, hawkish on the Korea issue despite the summits,
And
very
hawkish on
hawkish.
Russia, to be
Yeah,
fair.
yes, nobody's been tougher on Russia than me, the old Donald quote. And I would say out of all of them, especially Iran, when it came to pleasing
Yeah.
his Zionist handlers. Point being is, I believe what they're trying to do right now. And you'll notice they've shut up about the Trump Russia stuff. They shut up about all of that. Even the people who despise him rarely talk about him in that context. They'll talk about how uncouth he was, but point being is even the anti-Trump rhetoric from the liberal side has calmed down a lot. And you'll recall for about the first 6 months after he left office when Biden got in, that again first you could say January through like the summer 2021 up until like the Afghanistan withdrawal, people were still doing the at least it's not Trump or here's how Trump would have done it worse. But even that's quiet down. Again, what I think is happening right now with Trump, and I'd love to be wrong about this, but unfortunately I don't think I am, is that they are selling him. They're selling this to him, of course, as this man with this massive ego. That you can come back, you can be the hero, you can be the guy who makes America great again by standing up to our enemies, like Russia, like China, like Iran. You can scrap all these treaties that were put in place by your quote unquote weak predecessors, in which case I wouldn't disagree with calling some of them weak, however. But point being is, and you can be the one who comes back from Sleepy Joe and how he let so much American power and prestige slip under him, and you can be the great redemption arc. And honestly, I think the establishment would be in love with that Donald Trump, and I think they're grooming him for a second term right now, and that arguably they want him back in so they can use him, they can use his name, they can use his um, great amount of internal support from the Republican Party and from his core base in order to advance these things that were completely antithetical to what he even originally campaigned on.
Yes, as we've been saying, that even before the invasion, the right in the West will be split between for and against Russia or for and against Ukraine, and intelligence communities that are in all kinds of chat rooms are fully aware of this. They know they need these kinds of guys to go into Ukraine. Now, one of the things I'll propose is, what if Trump is there as a cheerleader to get Americans to go fight in Ukraine, right? They would be training in Germany and Poland, and they would be going in. This is what Scott Ritter has been talking about, right? Now, he has not mentioned American troops or NATO troops going in, right? They're afraid of that because I think they are rightfully afraid that Russia might use nukes in a limited amount, and or they don't want to risk that from happening. But what if we understand that that America cannot back down, right? Because symbolically this would be too grave of a defeat. And what if they start running out of Ukrainian men? If you look at the guys who are surrendering around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk right now, like these guys are in their 40s.
And yeah,
They're
once
not,
again,
they're,
we
they're
discussed
not even in their 30s.
the conscription drive where they tried to conscript a lot of non-Ukrainians, such as Hungarians, such as Rusins, etc., where that just completely fell apart to the point where, and again, I know Ukraine is
They're
a
not
mostly homogenous country, but a point being is like they're scraping the bottom of the barrel for troops right now.
right, right. But they can't back down. So someone else is going to have to start going in, right? Now it won't be just as simple as dissolving the border between Poland and Ukraine, because they'll need to quote unquote weaken Russia. They're going to need to drag out this war as long as possible. And this is why I think Russia has been slow and steady with its sanction packages or its new rules of transactions for its commodities. Um, they let one out every few months, and each one sends like a shockwave that reveals the absolute dependency that Europe has on Russia in many, many more ways than just energy. This, of course, hastens the Americans to act more quickly, to figure out what to do in order to stop this, right? Um, I think even America has a breaking point about just how devastated Europe can get, because the food for rubles uh, is going to be a much bigger shock to Europe than the little game that they're playing right now, where Germany is buying gas and oil, and these countries that pretend that they're not, they're paying several times more for the same gas and oil, like Finland, like Bulgaria, like other countries, um, who are virtue signaling. Nonetheless, they are still buying that gas and oil from the Russians vis-a-vis Germany, right? Um, and you've got now 21 companies, 14 more expected by June to go along with the rubles for gas, right? The oil, so-called oil embargo has completely collapsed. So what are they going to do now when food is running out? That is when governments get toppled, and they're not going to be color revolutions. They're going to be much more organic. Uh, Europe cannot afford, America cannot afford Europe to be in chaos if it wants a decades-long war in Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely. And it is, once again, one of the points we've always been hammering on, a race against time. And I think they do need, bringing this back around to the Trump thing, somebody who will be a bit of a hard ass about this. And honestly, the best person they can think of is Donald Trump. And it's a
Yep.
really easy sell with his ego. It's a really easy sell that, think about the legacy you can create for yourself. You were knocked down, but then
You
you came
defeated
back.
Russia like
Yeah,
Reagan.
yeah. You're the next Ronald Reagan. You're the comeback kid. You got knocked out of office and you're back in. All these different mythologies they can sell to Donald that will just really entice him. And even if, as he is like 78 years old, and even as he is again old and gray, and probably getting even more decrepit and less coherent, it is just what they want him. And again, I know a lot of people early on, especially when he first ran for office, or when he first took office, said he complete controlled op. He was never on our side. Blah blah blah. And again, I do think there is some merit to that. But
Oh yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
Trump 2.0 is going to be all of that definitively. There will not be even room for debate that we're looking at the Donald Trump that many people thought we had first on will certainly be one. It will certainly be the Donald Trump that we do get in 2024 and onward.
Yeah, great point. I mean, he's literally there to get right-wing men to go and fight in Ukraine. That's what he's there for. He's there to unite the right.
Oh, hey, wait a minute.
Right? They need like this like, I mean, just because there's some even if it's an army of blue check mark shitlibs on Twitter that are decrying Elon Musk and decrying Trump, not to mention, you know, um, people in much bigger, more important positions of power, like judges in various circuits, that were put in place after Biden's victory. Those people, there'll be other people around them that are going to be screeching, but I think they're going to get the memo, um, just like BLM got the memo. Okay, Trump is defeated. We don't need you anymore. Yeah, you're going to have the same number of black men who are killed every year that don't possess a weapon when they're killed. That's not gonna stop. That was there when Obama was in power, and that's going to be there forever. That's just the way it is. And you're going to be quiet because we have a much larger issues external to the domestic issues that are more important. And I think it's something that the media, it could do it. It could do it. They would have to be like an early period of reconciliation. Uh, Look, when Trump got elected, nobody foresaw that George Bush Jr. Would be watching sports ball with Ellen DeGeneres. But here we are, right? I know she doesn't have a show anymore. That's irrelevant. Um,
Yeah, that's
However, I
far from
think
the
that's
only
the
case
kind
of
of
something
remake
like
they
that.
want. I think even the propaganda, dark MAGA, right? The dark MAGA isn't going to be about making the libs cry, though they will. The dark MAGA is going to be about, like, Trump will, I'm sure, have speeches I tried to reason with Putin. He's a madman. He's crazy. I've done the best I could. I'm going to have to lay the hammer down, whatever. We need to, and there'll be
Maximum
men
pressure
who will
campaign.
want
He
to
will
believe
dig
that.
that up. That's what he
With
said about
Oh yeah,
Iran.
they
Yeah.
will eat it up, no problem. And the thing is, you're seeing this in Eastern Europe. Like we've been talking on the show for at least 2 years now about how there are countries in Eastern Europe. Their very survival depends on America staying on top forever or else. And because they don't even have the leadership to navigate the world without America being number one, right? If you look at the Azov battalion, like why did they do this? And I've spoken many times on this show about me having conversations with these guys back in 2014 on Google Plus. It's not that they didn't see that America was decadent. It's not that they didn't see that America could be losing power, right? Less so that in 2014, more so that now. What they want is to get as much power out of the empire, as many resources as possible, because they see it going down. You
Oh
see what I
yes, and
mean?
that's why the push for intermarium is so hard right now. And again, you can see this with other empires historically. They delegate powers and privileges to tributary states, to these smaller border territories, because their internal affairs are becoming much more difficult to manage on top of their foreign obligations. And I imagine much in the same way you will see a more resurgent Japan on top of these Eastern European countries wanting to form their own block of power, on top of, again, also even Middle Eastern powers. They still probably will try to deal with Turkey in some sense to try to turn them into vassal
They'll
states.
try, but
Yeah.
there's nothing that can sweep. What can they do? What can they
Yeah.
offer Turkey
Well,
more than it has now?
exactly. That's the point. It's in my opinion, if I had to prognosticate here, they're going to do that, and Turkey is going to, uh, let's just say, not repay the favor in the slightest. And
No, no.
that's being
Turkey doesn't
yes,
care.
yes, that's being generous about it. But again, I think they will be desperate enough to try to do something like that. But again, that's aside the point. So you have all of that again converging together, and once again, I mean, and this is something we brought up, I believe, about 2019, where, and this is another prediction for the late 2020s, and I would still maintain this one is also for the late 2020s, that as American power noticeably slips more, the chance of them using tactical nuclear strikes goes up exponentially. The fact that they would break out the big guns in that sort of case, that they might lob one at Tehran or something, isn't unthinkable at this point, because
Hmm.
they've been pushed into such a corner, and that they will do anything in order to maintain their power at that point. So we are entering into what I believe is a very contentious and arguably even dangerous territory that we've not seen since the height of the Cold War, when it comes at least to the nuclear risk. And that's again just talking about the big ones. That's not even talking about any other sort of conventional or any other sort of WMD strike from any country, as it were. That's becoming a much less stable world with these powers that are equipped with these sort of weapons, and it's going down a very, let's say, uncertain path, which does
Hmm.
bring me to some Middle Eastern news. I'll start first with the more pertinent one out of Syria, where Russian S-300 systems in Syria, they didn't hit it, but they did fire at Israeli aircraft that have been striking Syria, and even as of today, there were more Israeli airstrikes on Syria, so it looks like they are taking advantage of the current chaotic situation to strike at Syria right now. And again, things have been pretty quiet in Syria insofar as the end of, say, this rebellion. And I might have to eat my hat on the last summer at Idlib. We do only have a few more months for that to fall apart. Of course, Russian resources have been diverted from Syria to Ukraine due to the circumstances of the war. But point being is, you have the increase in Israeli strikes, which, as we've said previously from 2018 onward, is typically a sign of dissatisfaction with Washington, that they do want something more from Washington when they do conduct these sort of strikes
Mm-hmm.
on Syria. And again, I believe that the Zionist state, that so-called Israel, is actually in the weakest position it's ever been in. And this is a bit of a microcosm, but the funeral of the Al Jazeera journalist that they attacked, and let me just get the exact pronunciation of her name. I'm sure you all saw the footage. It was just, again, a normal funeral procession that was descended upon by riot police. And this was just somehow viewed as nothing to be concerned about. So that was Shireen Abu Alek. And was a journalist for Al Jazeera, was one of their main go-to people for covering on-the-ground stuff when it came to the conflict between the Zionists and the Palestinians, was killed as a result of the crossfire for this. And again, that's being generous about it. We could speculate on
Yeah.
whether it was deliberate or not. And while I would usually rejoice at something negative happening to a journalist, I will pick and choose my battles. I will play favorites with certain kind of journalists covering certain stories. In this case, I'm not happy about it because, it's against the Zionists. I'm not happy that they're able to run roughshod over the Palestinians. I have my clear bias on this conflict, as I do on pretty much everything we talk about on this show. But with all of that occurring within the past few days, and you saw this descend upon them, it was interesting because one of the usual framing devices the Zionists and the Zionist propagandists will use is we have to crack down on these Muslim extremists. Well, I mean, this woman was at least born and raised, I'm not sure, and it did appear to be a Christian funeral procession, and with some of the ways they were doing it, um, was a Melkite Catholic, one of the Uniate churches out of the Middle East, and that operates particularly in Palestine and the Holy Land, as well as Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. But it was just this complete descending upon just this normal funeral procession, and um, once again you see this happen time and time again. This one got more publicity than I would say usual because it was on top of the what is it? If I'm doing the math right, 74th anniversary of the modern state of Israel coming into being. That would be May 14th, May 15th, and again, those that this past week is always particularly contentious when it comes to that conflict because it is again the week in which the modern Israeli state was founded. So you have a lot of Palestinian resistance. You recall that's when Trump chose to open up the Jerusalem embassy in 2018. So for the 70th anniversary. So that certainly wasn't inflammatory or anything like that, and we certainly wouldn't expect anything more out of that, from a dark MAGA president Trump. Look, you want to know what dark MAGA means? It means another 500 billion to the black community. That's what it means. That's what the dark.
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
the
wow.
that's the joke I pulled when I first saw the dark MAGA stuff. I was like, so this means another half a trillion to blighted urban areas, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. So on top of that, you have Israel just really lashing out between the strikes on Syria, between this, and it seems to have been this pattern since about 2017, 2018, where they're absolutely lashing out. I wouldn't put it past them to do a strike on Iran over the course of the next year. So talking from right now, May 2020 to May 2022 to May 2023. I wouldn't rule out a direct strike on Iran on the Israeli part, especially if tensions do rise in the Middle East, as I imagine they will globally. And really, I think Israel knows with the retraction of the American empire, with failure to sway over Russia and China to the extent that they swayed over America, that their position in this current global order is not guaranteed. And if you want to be really severe about your predictions, its position as a sovereign state is not even guaranteed. We could see the end of a Zionist state. Now, I won't go that far, at least for the time being, but point being is I believe that Israel has, again, a few options the next couple of years here. Maybe, okay, let's say next 8 years till the end of the decade. They can either come to terms with their neighbors, which, funny enough, that's something that was actually happening under Trump. However, the negotiation process under the Abraham Accords between Israel and the various Gulf states were much more pro-Israel. So, and maybe that's another reason they're trying to get Trump in, secure the Israeli position in such an uncertain world. They can either parlay with their neighbors, come to terms with them, or they can lash out like they are, or probably the most drastic and least likely option is they can go Samson option. I wouldn't put it past them, but I don't think they're going to do it. And of course, that would violate. I'd imagine that would violate the policy of nuclear ambiguity. But again, I would say the second is the most likely there. Israel will continue to lash out as the American empire retracts because it will need these absurd shows of strength as time goes on, as things continue, where it can't afford to look weak even for a second. And I don't know, we could see further action against Hezbollah. We could see, I I imagine
Well,
a
now that
lot
you
of
bring up
action against.
Hezbollah,
What was that?
oh, you brought up Hezbollah. That just reminded me of something. Go ahead.
But again, we can especially imagine in the West Bank and Gaza that they will be as heavy-handed as we've ever seen them. And I imagine Syria will also bear a significant brunt of this. And like I said, I wouldn't rule out a direct strike on Iran. I know people have talked about that for years, but Israel's getting to the point where it's desperate enough where it might do those strikes on Iran.
Yeah, the attack that you mentioned today that actually killed 3 Syrian servicemen on the outskirts of Damascus. But what Israel is afraid of is they believe they have intel that the Iranians have moved a missile system across Iraq, across Syria, and is now in Lebanon. And Hezbollah has it. And I was saying last year that the sophistication of the Palestinians, the way they attack the Israelis at an incredible cost, nonetheless, despite that, showed like just a certain level of gall, like from an Israeli point of view, that and sophistication from an objective point of view that they had developed, right? And we've already mentioned that Russia has already like they have worked with Hezbollah, but they are also working now with Hamas. And what Israel is afraid of is another scenario like 2006, where Hezbollah essentially defeated Israel, right? That's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of that Hezbollah is going to launch some provocation that will force Israel into Lebanon. And I think this is why, you had the mysterious port blowing up in August 2020, and the poverty level right now in Lebanon is through the roof, and so on and so on. And a lot of
Emigration rate
people,
is comparable to pre-war Ukraine.
right? And that's a great point. But the people that aren't going to leave uh, Lebanon, those are going to be Shia Muslims. They're not going to leave. They'll weather this. They're tougher than that, and I think Israel is fully cognizant of that. A lot of people in 2020 were hypothesizing that, and even in 2021 they were doing the same thing. Oh, this is it for Hezbollah, and I would think like, dude, I know you're a right-wing guy in the West that you do want to kind of see that happen, but that's not going to happen. Like, these people are very tenacious, and I don't doubt the Israelis when they say that they have brought missile systems into Lebanon because they want revenge. Um, Hamas and Hezbollah have begun to work, and I think the interlocutor for that has been Russia. That's why last week, roughly about a week, maybe 8, 9 days ago, when Hamas visited Moscow, that's what I think that's about.
I think once Netanyahu, ironically enough, was gone, that all bets were off the table. That when Bennett started to pursue his policy, even after he tried to reconcile with Russia, after he pulled out of many of these agreements pertaining to Syria in particular, is that I think, especially at this point with the current state of the American empire, with everything, that uh, Russia's patience with Israel has been completely exhausted. Now, I imagine we'll see more of these types of incidents in the coming months, coming years. But point being is the very let's just say, workable relationship they have with Russia under Netanyahu has completely evaporated, and now the idea of a so-called Western aligned country cooperating with Russia is going to be out of the question. Israel is not going to do that, and Israel is realizing that despite even how Jewish Biden's cabinet is, the Zionist lobby is not what it was 20 years ago. They do not have the same sort of sway over Washington that they do 20 years ago. And again, I,
Hmm.
I know it's these clowns like AOC or Ilhan Omar, I think it is, who put forward these resolutions before Congress to recognize. I can't remember what the Palestinian term is, but for the establishment of Israel, that they do consider a day of mourning because of the amount of violence that happened, and for condemnation for West Bank settlements or any of these sort of things, where although they are nowhere near a majority, although they don't really hold that much sway, there is a small growing contingent, especially from the non-white left in the United States, that is openly anti-Zionist, that will go that length, and as they do assume positions of power, will exercise that power, at least in a token fashion, to show that we are anti-Zionist, that we stand with Palestinians, that whatever.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so point being is, they don't have a solid guarantor in the United States anymore, even with, again, Biden's kosher cabinet. Not really anyone in Europe that they can turn to expect the same sort of support. I mean, maybe the British, but I mean, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't have the resources to do that. Russia and China, we've previously discussed, will not be the new patrons of Israel, to the point where it's a dire state for them. And I know you were talking about some of these Eastern European countries that have their existence reliant upon the United States because they don't have the leadership otherwise. I mean, aside from not being in Eastern Europe, that description fits Israel perfectly. They do not have the self sufficient systems to survive on their own. They're wholly dependent on the United States for their existence, whether that be from a security standpoint, from a technology standpoint. They can boast about Israeli innovation all they want, but again, that comes from American grants, that comes from American cooperation, that comes from industrial espionage, if we really want to get into it. But
Apparently, it also came from 100 engineers from Russia.
oh
That's
boy,
I learned that last week.
that's that's an interesting one to say the least. And it does make you wonder. And you saw some of this rhetoric in about 2018, where they were talking about the historically Jewish parts of Ukraine, like around the Galicia region around Lvov, where there was a large Jewish population historically, uh, talking about that as if it were a second Israel, as if it were a second prospect for another Zionist state, another safe haven for Jews, being that cross section of Eastern Europe. So you could also look at the conflict in Ukraine from that perspective. I don't think that holds enough traction to be the case yet, but as their position in the Middle East becomes more untenable, I imagine you will see sort of reversed in the trends of emigration you saw from Europe and the United States to Israel, where you see a lot of those Jews living in Israel either go back to Europe or more likely the United States, as again, the United States in raw numbers has as large a Jewish population as the state of Israel does.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I can imagine that the so called safe haven for the Jewish people will actually see significant amounts of emigration as the situation becomes more dangerous there. They will take refuge in the United States. And again, there also is that question, will there be a attempt at establishing yet another Zionist state, such as from the ashes of post-war Ukraine? Because I imagine the conflict in Ukraine will probably have at least ceased to the point of where it is today um, by the time they would actually have to answer these questions. But point being is, could we see another style of that conflict where the Jews coming out of Israel are seeking yet another safe haven, because that safe haven, if it hasn't fallen, is not quite literally by definition not a safe haven. And I do think these are real questions to look forward coming to this, especially once again, as we stated, the Jewish presence in Biden's cabinet. Imagine what a Trump 2.0 cabinet would look like. I don't even want to imagine what that would look like demographically. And again, with Jared Kushner whispering in his ear, with all these other people whispering in his ear, what was it? Paul Singer, uh, the guy who runs Home Depot, Bernie Marcus, and some other one. Paul Singer, Bernie Marcus, and some other one were the three big donors of the Trump campaign. The three people really convinced him to leave the JCPOA. And I imagine they have plenty more favors to extract from Trump moving forward.
I mean, I'm glad you brought this up because I think part of the inability for America to deal with the migration issue and the rapid changing of the demography of America and all the issues. You can't even talk about this, because you're racist, you're a Nazi. Um, I think part of that is basically the plan that, or it's based on foresight of the worst case scenario that is going to be tougher as America relies more on soft power and less on hard power, and that its hard power in and of itself, as you mentioned earlier, means escalation towards nuclear arms because it's developing an army that's really for soft power within the states. That's what the whole woke thing is about. Now, with Trump, if they set up like a contingent that is willing to fight wars to save the West, if they're willing to get into that kind of rhetoric, okay. But they're not going to allow the change of where American culture is being developed at the moment, just because of that. Well, it's kind of like, and you see guys like Greg Johnson and other people on the right, uh, Richard Spencer is another example where they feel like they're like the guys in Azov. It's like, well, they won't be able to help themselves after we do this great favor for them. There have been like world leaders that did favors for them. Gaddafi's another one. We don't just have to mention Lukashenko and Erdogan, right? Gaddafi did favors for them. Gaddafi, changed his tune, as it were, and then that's when they killed him. um, Saddam Hussein is another one, or let's say Assad,
Oh yeah,
got rid of
yes.
all the.
Like I mean, he's the exception.
Yeah, he's survived, but he, as you say, um, but he's lucky. He really is the exception. But he got rid of the chemical weapons, and they still accused him of having chemical weapons. Uh, so yeah, it's yeah. I would say that this is they are essentially planning for a worst case scenario.
Yes, and I was going to get into the monkey paws, but I know this episode is going to be long enough as it is after we combine these two parts. I think this might actually be the longest episode of the War Report on record, even longer than some of our years in review. But
3 hours.
yeah, damn, there was a lot to cover. We're
There
only
was.
like we're just about like 2.5 hours. So
Yeah.
I hope you guys have enjoyed this lengthy episode of the War Report. I'm sorry it's so disjointed because of our little technical difficulty from last night, but we covered a lot of ground, and we hope to see you all next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.